I think the main thing to say about any of these mental health homicide investigations is that the focus, although we're doing a lot of looking back, the focus is very much on trying to reduce the risk of similar incidents happening again. I don't think we can ever say 100% that we can stop this, but we can reduce it. But almost more importantly, following on from Doug, the idea is to try and improve services for everybody, regardless of whether there might or might not be a serious incident. So, for example, one of the key themes in this was about involving carers and family. And involving carers and family should improve services for all service users, for most service users, and for their families, regardless of whether or not there might ever be a serious incident. So I'll just give you a bit of context about the incident itself. We're going to call him Graham. He travelled from Brighton to Scotland with the intention of killing his father. He was driven by false but convictions that his father had sexually abused him as a child. This, in fact, was completely false, but he was quite convinced. So he was going to kill his father to get his own back. He also had a list of other people who were allegedly complicit in this, and they were sort of next on the list. So he travelled to Scotland. He very severely assaulted his father, whose life was endangered but survived. Unfortunately, his mother, who had a known serious pre-existing heart condition, he did assault his mother, sort of pushed her, which under normal circumstances might not have been a problem, but because of the heart condition, she died. Because it was in Scotland, he was charged initially with murder and then pleaded guilty to culpable homicide, which, as I understand it, is the Scottish equivalent of manslaughter, and assault to danger of life, which was the assault on his father. And he was sentenced to indefinite detention. Under Scottish law, the Scottish Health Minister must consent before he can be removed from this high secure hospital. This is just to try and give you a bit of an overview of the sort of complexities of this case, sort of geographically. He was born in Scotland. The incident happened in Scotland. His family origin were in Scotland, and he went to a high secure psychiatric hospital in Scotland. He was also seen by an autism service in Scotland. His first former partner, with I think then a 13-year-old daughter, lived in London at the time of the incident. His second former partner and a younger daughter lived in Brighton. Graham had moved between Scotland, Brighton, London, and back and forth, but received most of his mental health services from the Sussex Trust, and I'll give you a bit more about that in a minute. And this just shows a bit more detail of the family. His parents, who lived in Scotland, Graham had a sister, a brother, and a sister-in-law, and then the first former partner and daughter in London, and the second in Brighton. So he moved around the country. He'd studied at Glasgow School of Art and graduated there. He met the first former partner in Glasgow, and that relationship didn't last very long. She moved to Brighton to be near her parents to help her bring up the child. He followed her, and he did have quite a lot of contact with her and the child and her parents, and then she moved to London to work. When Graham was in Brighton, he met his second former partner. They moved to Glasgow for a while, which is where he saw the autism services. Graham's behaviour was becoming increasingly odd, and his drinking was causing problems. So she moved back to Brighton with the younger daughter. He followed, but they lived separately and remained in contact, and she saw herself as his carer. She helped him to get mental health support, helped him to get GP support. we met as part of the investigation the father, brother and sister-in-law and sister, and we also met separately both the former partners as part of our investigation. I think always now we're expected to take quite clear steps to invite the family, any carers, to contribute to an investigation. And I've now spoken to quite a lot, and the response is quite different. Some people don't want to know. Some people will talk to you, but they're not very comfortable about it. This family, the family of origin, were incredibly welcoming. They're not only generous with their scones and jam and tea, but were very generous with their contributions, very open, very honest about the relationships in the family, how things had happened. And they were very keen to help to try and improve services and reduce the risk of this happening again. So again, this is a bit more of the background. He had 6 CBT sessions, which were provided by the Trust, Sussex Trust. He was discharged, improved, and he saw them for his social anxiety, and he was using alcohol to overcome the anxiety, but the alcohol was triggering aggression. He moved to Glasgow, where he was referred to the Glasgow Autism Service and was assessed as having Asperger's syndrome, and he was given some support and information to try and help with that. Then she returned to Brighton, he returned to Brighton, and in September, October 2012, he was referred urgently for an initial assessment because he'd gone to his GP. He was after help, and it's quite interesting, all the professionals thought he wanted help to manage his delusions, his difficulties. He wanted help for the mental health professionals to say all his delusions were real, and that would validate. So his idea of wanting help was virtually the opposite of what the people offering help. So he was getting increasingly odd. He got these conspiracy theories. I don't know if anybody remembers David Icke, who was a newsreader, and he got very engaged in David Icke's theories. He thought his parents were reptilians. He thought he and his sister were star children. And there was this conviction that his father had sexually abused him, that his mother and brother were complicit, that a school teacher had drugged him and assaulted him. So all that was driving him eventually to this homicide. So that's the background to the case. And Tony's going to talk you through the findings and the recommendations.
Thank you. I'm very quite daunted. I was looking at the biographical details of the other speakers as well, and it just suddenly occurred to me that when you're very young, it's very, very difficult to try and write up your CV, and then suddenly you find yourself getting very, very old, and you realise just how more difficult it is to listen or see it written down as biographical details. But I hope that biographical details contained in the pack about ourselves, and certainly speaking for myself, I hope that it sort of reinforces the fact that I still stay within the operational services, and therefore I feel quite privileged when we undertake these types of investigations of these serious incidents, which is mainly always homicide, that it is a privilege to be able to offer a critique and hopefully offer an opinion and advice in relation to people's practice. And I say that without wanting to at all sound patronising. I know that there are people here who are what I call heavy-duty practitioners. They really are at the sharp end of the service. And therefore, when we undertake these investigations, we're always guided by the fact that we should not use hindsight. My argument always in response to this is that nearly everything we do is connected with hindsight. These events have happened, and therefore we do an awful lot of reflection. So, as Maggie has already pointed out, and as we pointed out at the final meeting we had with the respective authorities concerning the care of this particular perpetrator of the incident, that we recognised the need for the victims of the incident to be heard, but to be, more importantly, for them to be actually understood. Now, this is rather strange for us. We've done literally scores. It sounds terrible, but we've undertaken scores of deep dive investigations into homicides, and very often, of course, the victims are dead. So we don't really get a thorough understanding. But clearly, in this particular case, the reason why it was somewhat unique was that the intended victim was still alive, although very, very, very badly injured, quite horrifically injured. So part of the understanding was to make the point that what had occurred had in common with a lot of other violent acts that whether or not they'd been perpetrated by someone who was mentally ill. And the general perception, I think, is that the act is a shared experience, as though that when the violent act occurs, that there's some form of mutuality, and of course that is not the case. They are two separate experiences that actually occur together, if that makes sense. So, in other words, the suffering belongs to the victims alone. And the reason I'm trying to make this point will come, I think, clearer in a moment, is that the violence of the incident, whether it be physical or psychological or emotional, is in the sole ownership of the perpetrator. And when we finished the report, I think the legal people who obviously scrutinise what we say they were quite interested. In fact, they were very complimentary that we'd actually taken that point of view, because very, very often that doesn't occur, and so the focus really then is just on the perpetrator, and then we're looking for things that have gone wrong in terms of their care. So the insight and the remorse that was expressed by this particular this person, Graham, since he was admitted to the state hospital, the high secure hospital in Scotland, we recognise that in our report, but it was an integral part of the mental health care and treatment that was being made available to him then. I've worked for many years, either right from being a nurse in high secure to later on becoming the inspector of the high secure services, and then national advisor of mental health, the English National Board, and focusing particularly on high secure care. And I remember there used to be a sort of a triangle, a pyramid, showing where resources went in terms of for mental health. And of course, at the bottom of the pyramid was community care and people caring for people in their own homes, etc., as it went up into sort of medium and then low secure services. And then you got to the high secure services. Then lots of things happened. Lots of resources were pushed into your care provision. And I always felt that the triangle should have been turned upside down. It seems to me that if the resources and the help and the assistance and the expertise available was available at the beginning of the process, that is in the community and in the families and so on, that would be much more useful. In fact, one of the pillars of wisdom in the high secure services when I was a young nursing officer, I remember one guy telling me, he said, you know, Thompson, if you ever decide to go mad, make sure you go berserk, because if you go berserk, you'll get admitted to a high secure hospital and you'll get everything that you want. You'll have as many psychologists as you want, psychiatrists, occupational therapists. But if you don't, it's a different story down there. And he's probably quite right. So I'm telling you that because we did want to focus on this particular report that the ownership of the act was with this perpetrator. So we finished our terms of reference regarding the contact that he had with the Sussex Foundation Trust, highlighted that any possible human errors tended to emerge from systemic factors throughout the organisation. And I was speaking to our host just a while ago saying that one of the things about this particular report, that there was nothing contained within it which was referred to the Sussex Foundation that could not be really applied anywhere throughout the UK, the issues that we had to deal with risk and so on. So we finished then by saying that the process of our investigation was aimed at this forward accountability, the need to help the Trust to learn any lessons so that where at all possible, future people could be protected from avoidable mistakes. The reason that the particular slide is on there at the moment is that we chose to look at that rather than we are specialists in the analysis of root causes, but in fact we find that when we're dealing with investigations with human services, we choose James Reason's sort of model construct to, we prefer that construct to, as it's more appropriate to elicit than it is to try and elicit a single root cause of a particular event. To try and get to suggest that because somebody did something they shouldn't do or didn't do something they should have done is not quite so simple as I'm sure many of you would appreciate when you're dealing with human services, and particularly when you're dealing with people, as Maggie has described, who are irrational in their beliefs. But the model we find is useful because we find that wherever people work and whatever type of service they are in, that mainly, if you can think of a Swiss cheese, if you think of it sliced like that, that if an accident or an incident is going to happen, it will only happen if it can get through the holes in the cheese. If they get lined up, that's when it happens. So it's usually multiple events that occur or multiple elements that suddenly allow it to get. But normally, in most services, every day. My son's a professor and chair in Leeds University and deals with evidence-based health, and he would say quite often that it's amazing how many practitioners, whether they be nurses, social workers, and so on, how many decisions that they have to make within an hour, within 1 hour. It's just unbelievable when you see it mapped, right? So if that's the case, it seems that most decisions, most things we make that might contribute to making a mistake, might contribute to not getting the correct information, most of them bounce away. There's usually some barrier there that stops it. There's either somebody more senior or somebody more knowledgeable, or there's another form to fill in, and it prevents that. However, in this case, I think epitomised it. If it gets through, if things just happen at any one time, then it sort of increases the chances of that event occurring. So, if I can just sort of click this on. So the internal review that was undertaken, first of all, by the Trust showed that there was the possibility of the use of legal high, what was then called legal highs, and cannabis and alcohol, on this particular person. And we actually then could confirm that. In fact, what was happening was that he was more than dabbling in ingesting, taking in spice, something called mamba, skunk, which is now much more sort of popular in terms of sort of heavy cannabis and so on. And one in particular, spice, of course, at that time, people knew very little. Now, of course, people are more familiar with the effects that it has. So this was not someone that was going about everyday business and probably taking the odd extra drink that he should have done. It was not that. He was indeed been exposed to these drugs. It also, when we did our investigation, what it did raise was what people's general perception, in fact, in people, including lawyers, and how they view somewhere like Brighton. They think it's a sort of twee bungalow place where people eat ice cream and have a nice chocolate shop and so on. And that there's quite a big gay community, which shows that there's lots of arts and lots of culture. And when you sort of describe just sort of the sort of problems that the practitioners face in somewhere like Brighton, and you look at the transient population and so on, you look how near they are to major international airports and all that goes on, and so you realise that just exactly how these sort of holes, in fact, that we showed could line up. So anyway, the important background information was missed, especially from the general practitioner who gave a good background. And it's a common fault, we felt, as any assessment, including risk, tends to be on the here and now. Very often it has to be. So when people don't take the risk assessments, it's the here and now. So we find in a lot of reports that we do that there is a common fault of actually not getting really good background information. So we came to our findings then, having sort of consolidated the internal review, and we agreed entirely with what they found, but we put, I suppose, in a nutshell, part of the complexity of this case was rooted in the poor identification of risk points and the propensity that these had for actually contributing to the serious incident itself. And it was reinforced in some weak assessments based on inadequate record keeping, plus the service and systemic demands. At that time, there'd been numerous reorganisations of the units, reorganisations of the whole trust, reorganisations, restructuring, transitions of staff, of expertise throughout teams. There was assessment treatment services, there was the urgent response services, and they'd all had some form of systemic shift and movement, and therefore change to cope with, and we're working within that sort of particular context. But whilst it's not unusual for services to be criticised for not accurately responding to the service users' needs and seeking help, as Maggie said, the word help served to, I think, completely encapsulate the complexity of this particular chap's presentation. Because he was, in fact, wanting confirmation for his conspirating theories that were actual. He wanted to go to the services for help, because if he could get someone in the services to say to offer him some form of treatment, to give him some form of medication, he would then utilise that to say, look, I've been, and there's only limited help available to me, but I'm sane. I am sane. Therefore, if I'm sane, then what I'm believing is correct, and so on and so forth. And that's, of course, when we got these bizarre delusions, and then this absolutely horrendous idea that he was going to go and kill his father. So the point I would sort of want to stress at this moment is that it's very easy for us to bring cases in for some form of assessment, to look for some form of standardised risk assessment, to get these forms that sometimes they're ill-judged, not evidence-based, and they modified throughout the years, and people use checklists, tick lists, and so on to ensure that, if they can, when these things are supposed to act as prompts to go deeper. I'm just suddenly, my peripheral vision, just looking at some of members of the police force. And some of my colleagues in the police services tell me that this happens time and time again, where very often people are trying to assess risk, and it's sometimes portrayed as some level of defence, to defend the system, to defend the person that's doing the risk assessments, rather than for them to use it as a prompt to dive deeper in relation to all the features that are contributing to that risk. So therefore, the sort of frequency of any events and so on with this particular person was rather unusual, because he had a tremendous zeal for jumping in to any situation where he felt somebody needed protected, and he had done that in the past. He'd see someone that he felt was getting a bad deal, he would get up and he would literally pick them up and would throw them to the other side of the room. Very, very strong person. The other issue that we found particularly of interest in the report, of which you've got in the pack, you've got I believe you've got the breakdown of the report in the pack, and there are recommendations, was that it showed some unusual attributes of how people come through a system, and not least of all the fact that, as I said before, we didn't find it any use to try and see what someone had done wrong necessarily, or if they hadn't done something they should have done. Very often what they've done is worked piecemeal through the history of this particular person, and normally we find dealing with these cases that we're dealing with some form of subculture, particularly if it's around drugs and alcohol, homelessness and so on. And that's very often we relate to people that are relatively unintelligent, perhaps, uneducated, disinterested, disenchanted, alienated. This was not the case with this particular person. This was a very articulate, very intelligent, very educated family. But what it did do is expose how vulnerable, in fact, the practitioners are when they go about their everyday business of making records and so on. We did find some very, very good aspects of practice. This chap, for his anxiety, for instance, was referred to the IAP service, and I think it was before they really had such things as high intensity work and so they managed to bring him in very quickly to treat the anxiety. But of course, that's all they could do. They could only go through his perception, his self-reporting of his own particular risks, because that's what the IAP service does. It has to rely on the information they're getting from the person seeking to reduce their anxiety, etc., or the depression. But then, if the people had delved deeper, they'd have found that there was quite a history there of violence and extreme violence. So, I think at this juncture, what I'll do now, Maggie, is ask you to pick up on, I think it was the recommendations, if that's okay, and thank you very much. And I hope that if you do get the chance to read the report, that you will see that all the elements, as I said at the start, were there. They were all there, and they were no different to any service throughout the UK. And this particularly was the UK, because it was Scotland as well as England.
Caring Solutions have done quite a lot of work analysing recommendations from other reports going back to the 1980-ish, or mid-70s. We've probably done a couple of hundred reports, and the same key themes come up. It's around risk assessment, it's around care involvement. It didn't come up here, but it's around application of the Mental Health Act. It's around involving families. It's around training in various policies and procedures. So when we start, we can almost think, oh, these are the sorts of things we're likely to find. We also did, for NHS England and the Sussex Trust, what they called a homicide thematic review of homicides, and that was 10 cases that had happened in Sussex over a 10-11 year period, and they asked us to go through and look at common themes emerging on these cases, and also to look at their governance arrangements for learning lessons and implementing change, across the trust as opposed to just in relation to particular services. So we did that, and that will come up later on. But that's just by way of background to say that these things are not limited to individual cases. They're quite common thematically. And I think there may be other questions which I haven't got answers to around why is it X years on that we still can't do risk assessments properly, we still can't talk to families properly, and what's the issue around that. And it's certainly not individuals' fault, it's certainly not individual services' fault, because it's common across the trust, across the sort of country. Right, so the recommendations, the first one recommended that trust-wide risk panel develop a reliable method for systematically and comprehensively obtaining views of family members where appropriate when screening for risk. The trust has a two-stage process. They screen for risk, which is quite not superficial, but it's just picking up key themes. And then if at the end of that screen they decide they need a full risk assessment, then they go on to much more in-depth practice activity. This guy, he only had 2 contacts with the trust, and they only did the risk screen. They didn't move on to the full risk assessment. And one of the things I think that the biggest lesson for me as a layperson was the wealth of information the family had about Graham's violence, his oddness, his strange behaviour, his strange delusions and all that. That if professionals had known at the beginning, it's possible they may have acted differently. It's obviously speculation, we can't guarantee they would have done, but that information might have changed the course of things. However, I've had a lot of information from the trust. They have reviewed their clinical risk policy. It's much clearer in the full risk assessment about having to involve families, and if you don't involve families, you have to record why not. So obviously some people don't have families, families won't have anything to do with them, they won't have anything to do with their families, and so on. So it's not always possible, but where it is possible, they should be involving families quite intensively. They've reviewed their training, they've got a very good, thorough e-learning package. And when I talked to them about this, I said, e-learning is all very well and good, but for things like risk assessment, where it's subjective judgment on complex presentations, what about face-to-face training? What opportunity do people have to discuss the scenarios you present? And they are moving now towards some more face-to-face training, and hopefully that will help to do more thorough risk assessments when people present. The second recommendation was around ensuring that all staff fully understand the limits to confidentiality, particularly in relation to risk of harm to self or others, and that ensure that practice is in line with legal and professional requirements. And one of the things that we hear time and time again, and I just hope this comes to an end sometime, is, well, we can't talk to the family because that's breaking confidentiality. Well, it's not breaking confidentiality if you hear what the family has to say. If the family have concerns, then listening to that is not breaching confidentiality. Good practice is to ask the service user if they may discuss his or her condition and treatment with the family, and where possible to get consent, in which case you can discuss its clinical issues. If you don't get consent, then obviously you can't go and say, well, we've diagnosed your son with schizophrenia and da-da-da-da-da. What you can do is listen to what the family have to say. Hearing their concerns is not breach of confidentiality, and you do not need the service user's consent. And it would be really good if, before I retire, which won't be that long off, we stop hearing this, or we can't talk to families because it's a breach of confidentiality. So they are doing quite a lot of work on this. They've got a new policy on it. They've got learning events. They've got carers involved now in producing their training and in presenting cases. So they're very clear and they're working on trying to change the culture. And it's not something you can go back and audit, it's something about trying to change the mindset of people. That's what we're doing. 3 was around medical staff receiving sufficient support from colleagues and peers, and we did feel that the GP trainee didn't get, oh God, I've forgotten this as well, didn't get the benefit. So they have now, they've got job plans for consultants which are very clear about supervision and very clear about supervising trainees. They've got these bailing groups which we've never heard of, which turn out to be a sort of psychodynamic group, enabling trainees to talk about, in confidence, the service users they meet, where they might have difficulties in their own relationships with the service users, or they find their personal response to somebody is negative rather than positive, and how to work through those things. And those are compulsory. So again, they're doing quite a quite a lot on trying to ensure that their consultants are getting peer supervision and CPD, and their trainees are properly supervised. And one of the things that happened in this case, thinking back to Tony's slide on the red line going through the holes, the GP trainee saw Graham. He knew the case was complex. He knew he was unable to, he didn't have the skills to do it himself. Normally, he'd be able to see a consultant there and then. He would be able to hold the service user in the waiting room and go and talk to get advice. This occasion, his own consultant was off on a training course somewhere, and the other consultant who was normally in the room was on sick leave, so he just couldn't get access to more experienced support on the day. He did later on, but that was a sort of normal process, just all the barriers just weren't there. So that was around what that one came up to. The triangle of care, I don't know if people have come across the triangle of care. It's a systematic approach to involving carers, the service users, the sort of equal partners, wherever possible, in arranging the care and the recovery package and all that. And I think it's the only systematic, comprehensive approach in the country. And we recommended that they take this on board. And they have done that. They've done it from the top. The chief executive is very committed to the trust implementing this across the board. And they are working on this. And when I went to talk to a couple of people about the triangle of care, their strategic lead was explaining how they're doing this at a strategic level. But I also talked to somebody from the Brighton group who'd already set up triangle care. And it transpired that even without the leadership from the top, local services were doing their own work at developing involvement of carers because they were interested, because they were committed. So there was some very, very good work going on at local level, led by committed individuals, but it wasn't trust-wide. But I think the people working at local level are now able to go to other parts of the trust and say, well, it is difficult and there can be difficulties and it's a big change in culture, but this is how we've done it and this is how it's worked. And these are the benefits we've seen. So I think they've done really well on that. And then recommendation 5 was around continuing to monitor the implementation of the action plans from their internal review, which I have to say, I don't think, well, we were told quite early on, well, we don't go back and re-monitor. But what they have done as a result of the thematic review, they've now got a lot more focus on learning lessons and embedding it. Because what we found when we did this, that they've got policies that look great on the surface about learning lessons, but when I looked at board papers, which Teresa's mentioned, the actual embedding was much weaker than the policy suggested it might be. And one of the things we found, was that they've got hundreds of actions that come in from not only homicide reviews, but suicides, the CQC, other serious incidents. Their service includes elderly people, so they've got falls and malnutrition and all sorts of other things. So I think there needs to be something perhaps nationally about how all these recommendations get managed. And we've always said in homicide reviews that we shouldn't do any more recommendations than we think absolutely necessary. We don't repeat the internal ones. We're not looking for sort of lots of little things to try and make recommendations about. It's where we think these things should make a difference. So that's that. And the last, moving forward, I really can't speak too much to this, except for what Teresa's put up. They are doing a lot of work on how they respond to incidents and how they learn from incidents and how that learning happens across the trust. And it does link back to some of the medical training that trainees are going to some of their patient safety events and so on. So it seems to be making progress.